You are now listening to On One Radio, the talk show podcast station, bringing you the unfiltered news and information. This is Let's Talk News Report. Hi and welcome. You're listening to On One Radio, the talk show podcast station, bringing you the news report. Now, all information and resources are based on the opinions of the host unless otherwise noted. This podcast may contain some quotations or excerpts from copyrighted material. These uses fall well within the copyright doctrine of fair use. Now, today we're going to be talking about DHS, the Department of Homeland-Security, draft document. And the draft document is entitled White Supremacist or Greater Terror Threat. Now, I know a lot of people are going to, be like, I don't know, it's walking a fine line. But there are going to be quite a few people that are going to be in agreement with this. Now, a lot has been going on, which makes this kind of important. Now, this draft document, hopefully it will turn into something that is going to really help humanity because we need it the most right now. White supremacists present the gravest terror threat to the United States, according to a draft report from the Department of Homeland-Securit. None of the DHS drafts Politico reviewed referred to a threat from Antifa, the loose cohort of militant left-leaning agitators who senior Trump administration officials have described as domestic terrorists. To later draft versions of the same document, all of which were reviewed by Politico, describe the threat from white supremacists in slightly different language, but all three drafts describe the threat from white supremacists as the deadliest domestic terror threat facing the U.S. Now, like I said, this is very important because this is information that needs to be out there. Now, foreign terrorist organizations will continue to call for homeland attacks, but probably will remain constrained in their ability to direct such plots over the next year. Now, that's according to all three documents. Now, it speaks of Russia probably will be the primary covert foreign influence actor and purveyor of disinformation and misinformation in the homeland. The documents also state, now, former acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAllen last year directed the department to start producing annual homeland threat assessments. Politico reviewed three drafts of this year's report, titled DHS's State of Homeland Threat Assessment 2020, all of which were produced in August. Ben Weitz, the editor-in-chief of the national security site Lawfare, obtained the documents and shared them with Politico. The first such assessment has not been released publicly, and a DHS spokesperson declined to comment on allegedly leaked documents and on when the document will be made public. I'm nosy, so I was, kind of digging on this. Now, none of the drafts Politico review referred to a threat from Antifa. Okay. Now, two of the drafts refer to extremists trying to exploit the social grievances driving lawful protest. Now, Department of Homeland-Security Acting Secretary Kevin McAllen held a news conference to announce new rules about how migrant children and families are treated in federal custody at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington. The Trump administration announced the change in rules that would allow it to indefinitely detain migrant families who cross the border illegally, replacing the Florida's agreement, which limited on how long the government could hold migrant children in custody and how they must be cared for. Now, I said that to say this. That kind of plays a role in this as well, because as we know, good old boy President Trump targets white privilege training as anti-American, which kind of rolls into this because he's pretty much stating that they don't need this type of training. He's really calling it anti-American when we're having a very big problem racially. And white supremacists should be labeled as terrorists because there are so many people that are losing their lives. Now, the cutoff date for information analyzed in the earliest draft is August 3rd of 2020, while the cutoff date for the next two is August 27th. Now, John Cohen, who oversees DHS's counterterrorism portfolio from 2011 to 2014, said the draft's conclusion isn't surprising. This draft document seems to be consistent with earlier intelligence reports from DHS, the FBI, and other law enforcement sources that the most significant terror-related threat facing the U.S. today comes from violent extremists who are motivated by white supremacy and other far-right ideological causes. Whites, meanwhile, said the change in language on white supremacist terrorism is significant. It diminishes the prominence of white supremacy relative to other domestic violent extremism, and without being inaccurate, puts it in a basket along with other violent activity that may be more palatable for the administration to acknowledge. So you basically got to kind of play it down. They're playing it down just a little bit. Like, okay, yeah, it's violent, so we're just going to throw it over here with this. But this really should be number one on the list right now, because it is terrorism. I mean, they're hurting people. They're killing people. And this is... It even goes up the chain of command. It's in law enforcement and everything else. So many people have lost their lives behind this whole white supremacy. The threat from white supremacists. The early draft has the strongest language on the threat from white supremacists in an introductory section labeled Key Takeaways. Lone offenders and small cells of individuals motivated by a diverse array of social, ideological, and personal factors will pose the primary terrorist threat to the United States. Among these groups, we assess that white supremacist extremists who increasingly are networking with like-minded persons abroad will pose the most persistent and lethal threat. The key takeaway section of the next two drafts calls domestic violent extremists the most persistent and lethal threat, rather than specifically naming white supremacists. It's almost like they're trying to water it down and not put white supremacists up there. But you really have to call it for what it is. It's white supremacists. And it is a dangerous thing. Now, the document discusses white supremacists in greater detail when introducing the section titled The Terrorist Threat to the Homeland. Once again, language in the earliest drafts is slightly stronger than the language in the subsequent drafts. The earliest drafts introduces the threat from terrorism this way. We judge that ideologically motivated lone offenders and small groups will pose the greatest terroristic threats to homeland through 2021, with white supremacist extremists presenting the most lethal threat. Now, the next two drafts refer to domestic violent extremists rather than white supremacist extremists as the most persistent and lethal threat. All three drafts contain the following sentence further down in the same section. Among DVEs, which is short for domestic violent extremists, we judge that white supremacist extremists, WSE for short, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in Homeland through 2021. Now, the second two drafts, meanwhile, allude to violent agitators who have been present at nationwide protests against racism and police brutality. Violent extremists almost certainly will continue their efforts to exploit public fears associated with COVID-19 and social grievances, driving lawful protests to incite violence, intimidate targets, and promote their violent extremist ideologies. The second and third drafts, reviewed by Politico, say simple tactics such as vehicle ramming, small arms, edge weapons, arson, and rudimentary improvised explosive devices probably will be most common. All three documents note that 2019 was the most deadly year for domestic violent extremists since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Now, among DVE actors, WSE conducted half of all lethal attacks, 8 of 16, resulting in the majority of deaths, 39 of 48. The draft read, the assessment comes as DHS has faced scrutiny for its response to increasingly violent domestic extremism during the Trump era. Top DHS officials have spent years grappling with how to do more to combat the threat and long chafed at what they call disinterest from the White House. Now, we know this already. We know this particular part. The White House is stutter stepping. It's a total avoidance. It's basically trying to ignore the problem. Now, two former top DHS political appointees told Politico last month that White House national security officials shield away from addressing the problem and didn't want to refer to killings by right-wing extremists as domestic terrorism. But two former DHS chiefs both tried to make the threat a priority for the department, as DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen pushed then National Security Advisor John Bolton to make domestic terrorism a focus of administration's counterterrorism strategy. And then Acting Secretary Kevin McAllen also worked to highlight the threat, lobbying Congress to spend more on efforts to prevent radicalization. But current DHS leaders also have acknowledged the lethality of white supremacist extremists. And it goes on to state, I have no qualms criticizing the white supremacy threat, said Ken Kukulinchi, DHS's second in command, in a recent interview on MSNBC. Neither does the Secretary, neither does the Department of Homeland Security. We recognize when those people act out violently that they show the highest level of lethality, meaning if you compare the number of violent incidents to the number of deaths, the numbers of deaths relative to the incidents is very high compared to other types of threats. DHS leaders have been much more vocal of late in highlighting federal efforts to target Antifa. In a recent interview, host Tucker Carlson asked acting DHS Secretary Chad Wolf why the Justice Department hadn't arrested and charged the leaders of Antifa and Black Lives Matter. So I'm not sure why Black Lives Matter is in there, because they're not going around bullying, harassing, or hurting anybody. So that's kind of interesting right there, that they would even put Black Lives Matter in there, because they're trying to protect black lives and let the world know that black lives do matter. They're not bombing. They're not hanging anybody. They're not killing anybody. They're not arresting anybody, and they're coming up dead in police custody. So that's very interesting. But it goes on to say, this is something I've talked to the AG personally about, and I know that they are working on it, he replied. Attorney General Bill Barr has zeroed in on the group in the context of the federal law enforcement response to long-running vandalism, violence, and unrest in Portland, Oregon, after U.S. Marshals killed a murder suspect, Mr. Michael, who had described himself online as 100% Antifa. Barr touted the operation as a success. The suspect tried to escape arrest and produced a firearm, according to a statement from Barr. The tracking down of Mr. Michael, a dangerous fugitive, admitted Antifa member, and suspected murderer, is a significant accomplishment in the ongoing effort to restore law and order to Portland and other cities, Barr stated. I'm kind of stuck on this, why Black Lives Matter is even in this group, because they're not terrorists. They're not hurting anybody. Now, I do have to go back over to this article on Trump targets white privilege training as anti-American, because it really is intertwined into what was spelled out from the DHS document, because they are stutter stepping majorly on doing something about it, and Trump is really trying to not do anything about it. I mean, publicly, he's pretty much making his statement. He has directed the Office of Management and Budget to crack down on federal agencies' anti-racism training sessions, calling them divisive anti-American propaganda. So basically, he's saying there is no need for anti-racism training sessions. So does that mean the president himself is a racist? Does he feel like racism is okay? Is he supporting it? Because him doing this is definitely not saying that he is for Black America and trying to stop it. Lives are being lost. And he's majorly stutter stepping. We should have anti-racism training sessions. If you care anything about the people you're supposed to be representing, you would want to do everything within your power to ensure that American citizens are safe. And it's been serious. Now, OMB Director Russell Vought, in a letter to executive branch agencies, directed them to identify spending related to any training on critical race theory, white privilege, or any other material that teaches or suggests that the United States or any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. But there's a problem there, because we have people within the United States that are racist and evil. It has been proven. There is so much proof out there that this bullshit statement, you can wipe your ass with it. Now, that memo comes as the nation has faced a reckoning this summer over racial injustice in policing and other spheres of American life. Trump has spent much of the summer defending the display of the Confederate battle flag and monuments of Civil War rebels from protesters seeking their removal in what he called a culture war ahead of the November 3rd election. See, he cares more about the election than he do the people he is supposed to be actually standing up for. And to be brutally honest, this Confederate flag that they're in support of, it's not even the actual Civil War flag. This is not even the real Confederate flag. That's the crazy shit about this. This Confederate flag that everyone has up that support that particular flag is, its origin is originally from racist. That's what that flag is about. The actual flag depicting the Civil War is a totally different flag. The proof is in the pudding. You just have to do your research and find out. The president is not for we the people. His concern is the November 3rd election. His concern is defending those evil people. When the DHS has pretty much, they put it out there. They let it be known that white supremacists are terrorists. You cannot hide from the truth. They've put it out there. But meanwhile, he has rejected comments from the Democrat nominee Joe Biden and others that there is systemic racism, in policing and American culture that must be addressed. Now, Vaught's memo cites press reports as contributing to Trump's decision, apparently referring to segments on Fox News and other outlets that have stoked conservative outrage about the federal training. You don't want people to be more caring of other people? You don't want people to be more accepting of other people? I mean, it's crazy. Now, Vaught's memo also says additional federal guidance on training sessions is forthcoming, maintaining that the president and his administration are fully committed to the fair and equal treatment of all individuals in the United States. That's a lot of crack of bullshit. How can you sit there and say at the beginning that the training is anti-American? You don't want any money spent on it. It should not pretty much exist, but then turn around in the same breath and say that the administration are fully committed to fair and equal treatment of all individuals in the United States. Like, yeah, seriously. Think about that for a second. Now, the president has a proven track record of standing for those whose voice has long been ignored and who have failed to benefit from all our country has to offer, and he intends to continue to support all Americans regardless of race, religion, or creed, he added. The divisive, false, and demeaning propaganda of the critical race theory movement is contrary to all we stand for as Americans and should have no place in the federal government. So once again, he lies. It's a blatant lie. Or basically he's just reading something someone else wrote, because this is a lie. You don't want him to do this, but at the same time you say you're standing for those whose voice has been ignored. How? This is insane. Like, how? I truly believe that, yes, white supremacy is terrorism. And once again, like the document stated from DHS, lone offenders in small cells with individuals motivated by a diverse array of social, ideological, and personal factors will pose the primary terrorist threat to the United States. Among these groups, we assess that white supremacist extremists who increasingly are networking with like-minded persons abroad will pose the most persistent and lethal threat. Look at all the people who have died while in police custody. What about some of the people out there protesting who look like military? And I do say look like, because they weren't military, but they look like military and act like military. They pretty much came and snatched them people up. That's like kidnapping, just for adults. Protesters being kidnapped. People being shot. People getting a knee on their neck. I can't breathe. The list goes on. So how is white supremacy not? How is it not a terrorist organization? So tell me what you think. This has been your news report. Let me know. Comment, like, share, subscribe on YouTube and everywhere else. Because we're going to get it in on One Radio. We own one. Because Black lives do matter. This has been your news report. And I've been your host, Tony Williams. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Let's Talk News Report. I wish you the best and don't end up on the news over dumb shit. I've been your host, Tony Williams, and this is On One Radio, the talk show podcast.